And good evening. It's July 9th, 2024, and we're on our next collection of discussions in our Outside the Class series. This is a series from the Bible Project, and it's about the entire TaNaK, right? The Old Testament. On TheDustyFeet.com, in the Outside the Class section, we have the TaNaK, this Old Testament source video section, set up for your review. Because the intent of Outside the Class is for you to listen to that in-class lecture first. Of course, they're all going to be found in the source video playlist. We're going to try to keep these around 15 minutes or so. We'll make them easy to catch. We'll make them easier to catch up on. So we're on a quest, scroll by scroll, book by book, a journey through this collection, but with a fun and different twist on Outside the Class on the Dusty Feet. And before we forget, if you do find these kinds of podcasts useful, it's when you click the subscribe button. The reminders, they just help you. But also, if you think these might be useful to others, it's when you click that like button, because that is the way that YouTube chooses to share these to more people if they wish. So in this series, we're going to be covering the entire TaNaK, right, the Old Testament, and yet we're going to be doing it in the original order of this collection, the Hebrew Scriptures order. So, it could get very interesting as we get past the first 5. But right now, we're at the beginning. The Genesis, Bereshit. We're in chapters now 12 through 50. I need you to remember that these videos that we're going to be discussing, they're just the tip of the iceberg. They're just part of a learning series, again, that I highly recommend. And again, they can all be found on the Bible Project website and, of course, in our source video playlist. Because we're in this series, as I kind of want us to remember that there's probably going to be more questions than there are answers. We're going to try to respond to some of the information, and as we discuss it, I'm just going to leave it up to you if it's an answer. But there's going to be a lot of questions about all kinds of things of which we probably are not going to get to know, or maybe there isn't an answer. It is what it is. Genesis 12 through 50. The story is shifting from a global view and that dispersal, and the camera is panning down to one man, Abram, and his family. We're not going to get a real look into God's character and how he's described until later in the scroll. So we're in the same boat that the original audience is, in a sense, because we're hearing a story backwards about events long before them, and they're looking at it through their current lens. But that said, we are not looking at it through their lens. We're looking at it through our lens, and that at times can be very, very different. Because the story is actually, at first glance, it's rather abrupt. But in reality, as many scripture stories do, they start with maybe just a little introduction. I think our problem is that we're so often familiar with these stories that we tend to miss that. And at times we glance over other bits of the story. Probably for many reasons. But to be fair to the original audience, they were already exposed to Torah and the stories past this and the consequences of those choices. So also, maybe, why certain things addressed in Torah, well, they seem to address some of the behaviors that we're going to see in these stories, and to make sure that they don't repeat them. We're going to get there, eventually. Let's stay on course, because here we're introduced to a visit from God to Abram. It's an interaction with so many unanswered questions. I'm fine with it. Just we don't know. I mean, how did God commune with Abram? Dreams, visions, voices in his head, responses to prayers, even those not mentioned. Whichever, it seems that Abram's comfortable with the interaction, and his response is to say, yes. He just responds in kind. I did like how Tim mentions that in the previous stories, it was about men making their name great. And then this one, it's different, that we still have a name being made great. God makes that point, but it's because of God and because of Abraham's responses. I mentioned earlier things that we might miss, practices, traditions, understandings. It's a bit complicated in a sense. And yet for them, maybe the original audience, maybe it wasn't. Because God tells Abraham to go, right? Leave your family, go to a place that I'm going to show you. I will make of you a great nation, and those that bless you will be blessed, and those that curse you, well, they'll be cursed. There's more questions that arise, at least for me. I guess maybe because I just tend to make it challenging. Because does the blessing and cursing attached to Abram, does it go just for him? Or does it extend to what he will become, right? This nation, this thing promised by God. So maybe we might need to put that in a box, put a nice bow on it so we can remember and come back to, put it on the shelf. I expect we're going to see some things that are going to address that later. But the story makes it a point that Abram is 75 years old. He's well past the normal newborn's father age. And we know from the end of chapter 11 that Abram has no children of his own, since Abram's wife, Sarai, well, it says she's barren. One of those sideways looks that I like is that Abram is still married to Sarai these many, many years, and he's still there. He doesn't complain. So now we're at a point in the story where the original audience would be aware of something that we, at least in traditional churchianity, we probably wouldn't be. And that's the practice of Ebum. Abram's childless. He knows it. God knows it. So Abram brings his brother's son, Lot, to just help this story along, right? Abram packs up Sarai and his nephew Lot, and he gets ready to leave. Abram doesn't balk at God because he sees, obvious for him anyways, maybe not so much for us, is that Lot will be the heir to pass on from Abraham. I mean, Abram is putting Ebum to the test, right? He's putting into practice, in a sense, what it could look like. Because he hasn't actually married his dead brother's wife. That's a very common practice, but that point was to bear children, to keep the honor there of the family. So he takes Lot as his own to honor his dead brother and to care for him as if he was his own. And in that, Abram also gets the heir he needs for the blessing of a lineage that's going to become this great nation. I think the original audience saw it, maybe even agreed with it. And maybe as Paul Harvey so eloquently puts it, we get the rest of the story. Because Terah, Abram's father, he had already started this journey to Canaan, right? We got that at the end of chapter 11. He just stopped on the way. He settled in Haran, and he died there at the ripe old age of 205. It's interesting that he stopped at a place that was named after his dead youngest son. But that's where we start this journey, really in a sense, because we're really continuing this journey of Abram's father. But now there's a promise with, so much more. So context is very much part of the story. This is not in a vacuum. It's not an isolated story. It's all connected. I think the audience might have understood or thought they understood a few things. I think God, with this storytelling, is telling the record. He's setting the record straight. I just had a weird thought. Do you think during the storytelling, the reading of this scroll as they gathered together, that then somebody raised their proverbial hand to ask a question? Yeah? Or did they have to wait until the end to talk about it? That's a sideways thought, I know. But this is meant to be shared in a public setting. So I guess now you know where my brain goes. Back to Abram. Trust and obedience. Being noticed by God. These are elements of this story. And the promises of a priestly lineage to represent God to the scattered nations. It's very impactful. It's a destined journey, and yet it starts rather simply with just trust and obey. Maybe a bit of self-initiation. I think we get a glimpse that Abraham possibly was a bit of a thinker. But we are way early in the story, so we need to really keep in mind that the folks in the story, what they know or what they're familiar with, and of course that's going to be differing maybe in our understandings these thousands of years later. Because Tim makes it clear that the problem, it's going to develop, right? We just need to keep reading the story. But for them in the story, this happens over hundreds of years, right? This promise will patiently develop with a lot of learning along the way. You know, I could be way off base here, but I suspect that Abram was aware that anything that would resemble a nation and this promise of God, that's going to take those same hundreds of years, and that he himself, realizing that, he'd never see any of it. And it goes back to an earlier question. So was the blessed and cursed parts of the promise, were they just his lifetime, or maybe much more? Then Tim made a point, and I kind of take a bit of an exception to it. It's about the thing linking these stories together in these chapters 12 through 50. It's the repeated failures. So now, let's pick up a mirror, right? Be honest. Pick up a mirror. Story's about us. And we were part of that story. What would be our connection? I agree with the look of humanity. So yes, these stories all throughout these scrolls, really that connection are the choices, whether they're for God or counter to God. So maybe I kind of need to take that exception back a little in a sense, and yet at the same time, not push them out in front as failures. But get up, go stand alongside them and say, I'm right there with you. Because I guess an underlying theme of questions to ask, because are we expecting, really, honestly, are we expecting anything more from these real people in these real stories, anything different than being exactly as we are? Because do we tend to put them on a pedestal, and then when they fall, then we go and point out their failures? Was that really the purpose of the story? If this was one of our family's histories as to why we're here today, it'd be interesting to see how we would then view the stories. But sadly, I suspect we have, in our churchianity way of things, we've so talked it down at times, these wonderful people in these stories, because we even fixate on their humanness, that everything that they act in, and we forget that they're us, and we forget the beginning of the promises to Abraham. To bless, not to curse. To remember that if not for this beginning, starting with this one man, all of the messy lives that go behind him, and we're going to see him, but then we're going to see a nation that's going to be unveiled. And we're going to see another name change along the way. So I choose not to focus on the failures of these folks, the lineage of Abraham, these benefactors of that promise. Because if God is a promise keeper, then we should be even more grateful for these scrolls that we have today, this Old Testament, this TaNaK, because without it, we never get to the Messianic King, the lineages, the bloodlines. They get us to him. over many, many hundreds of years. And now we're but another part in the continuing of that story. Especially in today's climate, because I wonder how our stories are going to be viewed for those that come along behind us. So next, we're going to get into more of the choices, right, that Abram and Sarai and Lot make, followed by his sons and his grandsons and his great-grandsons. Because we'll eventually have more of that promise to see. This is going to be fun. And yet, I suspect, also challenging. So, thanks for being with us tonight on another edition of Outside the Class, the TaNaK, the Old Testament, on the Dusty Feet.